Picking up where we left off on episode 2.1, the pre-Columbian connection, a historian drops the bomb, the Danaoi connection. You'd expect this kind of theory to come from the fringes, but it didn't. It came from a University of Penn professor. In 1928, Lester B. Holland, a classically trained scholar and architect and holder of the Carnegie Chair at the Library of Congress, published The Danaoi in Harvard Studies in Classical Philology, Volume 39, pp. 5992. While the paper may have appeared modest at the time, it slipped through a series of radical reinterpretations of Bronze Age history that now read like a blueprint for the suppressed story of the Sea Peoples and their global reach, the forgotten chapter that rewires history. In this overlooked academic essay, Holland proposes a series of provocative and now strikingly corroborated claims that the Danaoi, the name Homer uses 138 times in the Iliad to refer to the Greeks, were not native Greeks at all, but connected to the Denyen, one of the major sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian records. That Cadmus, the figure credited with bringing writing to Greece, may not have been entirely Phoenician, but possibly northern or Viking-like in origin, embodying the integration of Aegean and northern maritime traditions. That the Meshwesh, a Libyan tribal group, were not random allies, but critical partners on the western flank of the Sea People's assault on Egypt, linked by cultural and military commonality with both the Denyen and the Lukka, and most explosively, when synthesized with our analysis, helps us connect that the Dan name cluster, Danaoi, Denyen, Danuna, Don, Danu, was not a coincidence, but the signature of a priestly military elite moving between the Black Sea, Aegean, Levant, North Africa, and beyond. This wasn't pseudo-history, it was peer-reviewed classical analysis from a Harvard publication. And Lester Holland wasn't a fringe writer, he was a respected intellectual with a firm grasp of Near Eastern and Mediterranean sources. The Meshwesh alliance, the Libyan flank of the Sea Peoples. Holland highlights the often overlooked Meshwesh-Maswes alliance in conjunction with the Denyen and the Lukka. Traditionally depicted as new arrival Libyans or desert raiders, the Meshwesh were far more than that. Their participation in Sea Peoples movements suggests a Phoenician cultural affinity, especially in names and dress, possibly indicating Carthaginian or Canaanite intermarriage or co-rule. Maritime capacity, the Meshwesh weren't isolated land tribes, but had fleets and tactics consistent with Sea Peoples' naval aggression. Their pairing with the Lukka, thought to be from southwestern Anatolia or even the Aegean, suggests a deliberate pincer strategy, a western Libyan flank and an eastern Anatolian Greek flank encircling Egypt and the Levantine trade routes. The Danaoi-Denyen continuum, the unified priesthood theory. Lester Holland's masterstroke lies in connecting the Danaoi of Homer with the Denyen of Egyptian war records. Both appear suddenly in the historical record in a window of 1485 for Danaus to 1475 BC for the Denyen. Both are associated with elite maritime warfare, skyfather worship, horned helmet iconography, and expansive shipbuilding capabilities. And the implications deepen. The horned helmets found in Danish bogs, for example, Vixo 1100 BCE, match precisely with Sea People's reliefs at Medinet Habu, suggesting a pan-European ceremonial standard, not cultural diffusion. The Danite tribe in the Book of Judges is said to have abode in ships, an odd description for a supposed Israelite tribe unless they were Sea Peoples themselves. Holland's reading suggests the tribe of Dan were Denyen mercenaries who merged into the Israelite narrative. Irish myths speak of the Tuatha Dé Danann arriving in the north by sea, carrying advanced technology, shining ships and serpent lore, another echo of the Dan network. Linguistic links, Danube, Dniester, Don, Danu, Denyen, Danaoi, not merely similar names, but a tribal brand stamped onto the geography of their trade corridors. Cadmus, Phoenician scribe or Viking sea king. Lester goes further. Cadmus, the bringer of writing to Greece, has long been considered a Phoenician prince, but Holland subtly questions that tradition. The fusion of Semitic literacy with northern martial culture, especially at the dawn of the Greek alphabet, suggests a mixed heritage, possibly a Phoenician Aegean elite with northern seafaring roots. Conclusion, a hidden elite in plain sight. Holland didn't need to shout. He encoded it in plain sight. His essay on the Danaoi, published under the Harvard imprint, reassembles fragments into a coherent hypothesis. that the Sea Peoples were not an incoherent migration, but an organized priestly military network, that the Phoenicians, Denyen, Meshwesh, and Danaoi were not ethnicities but regional franchises of the same ruling class. The Amu, 9 bows from Retjenu lands we described in our last episode. That Cadmus and his alphabet, like the Danites and their ships, represent logistics, not myth. With modern archaeology, genetics and comparative mythology now confirming R1b lineages, megalithic seafaring and the interweaving of Indo-European and Semitic symbols, Holland's forgotten chapter reads like a declassified document. He gave us the keys nearly a century ago. Now, with all the other findings in the time since then, we can finally synthesize history appropriately. The Hurrian hub. The Hurrians controlled the pivot point between 3 worlds, the Indo-European steppes, the Semitic city-states, and the Mediterranean circuits. They weren't just another Bronze Age people. They were the switchboard. The Hurrians gave us the first attestation of Danuna as a divine royal designation. Through Hittite correspondence, Hittites adapted Hurrian gods and are cultural derivatives of Hurrians, as are the Phrygians, Mitanni, and other vassals of theirs. The Hurrian axis also gave Semites the storm god Teshub, who becomes Baal and Belu, and was in use earlier than both Ugaritic and Akkadian use. Remember from our last episode, Akkadian Sumerian mythology is nothing like Sumerian mythology prior. They brought Proto-Indo-European Deus Pater culture across language barriers. Hurrians, Hittites, and Semites had the succession myths that becomes Greek mythology. The Hurrian to Hittite axis also brought cuneiform from their Akkadian allies and adapted it like the Semitic Akkadians had earlier to create the first Proto-Indo-Europeans' first writing system. When Hurrian princesses married into Egypt's 18th dynasty, they weren't political brides. They were installing operating systems, the Aten geographic connection. And we can trace exactly how this religious technology transfer worked. Ancient Hittite Hurrian maps show the city of Aten in Hurrian territory, sitting next to Thukan. Now watch what happens in Egypt during the exact period when Mitanni princesses are entering the royal family through marriage alliances. Akhenaten suddenly revolutionizes Egyptian religion with Aten worship, and his successor bears the name Tutankhamun. The geographic coordinates appear to be encoded in their very names: Atun, Aten, Thukan, Tutank. Whether through direct toponymic influence or symbolic adoption, these weren't Egyptian innovations. They were Hurrian religious technologies being imported through the same R1b pharaohs who carried steppe genetics. The sun god, Simage of the Hurrians, was becoming the Aten of Egypt through systematic elite marriage networks. This suggests the Amarna period wasn't spontaneous Egyptian religious revolution. It was Hurrian Anatolian elite influence operating through pharaohs who were more genetically and culturally compatible with northern religious political systems than traditional Egyptian ones. But the Cimmerian revelation, Iron Age network expansion. Holland's academic framework becomes even more explosive when we trace this network into the Iron Age. The Sea Peoples' dispersal around 1200 BCE wasn't the end of the story. It was setting the stage for an even larger coordinated expansion. Enter the Cimmerians. Hebrew sources call them Gomer, and Gomer becomes the ancestor of the Ashkenazi in later Jewish genealogies. This isn't coincidence, and it reveals something scholars have tried to keep hidden. The Cimmerians weren't just another nomadic tribe. They were direct descendants of the original steppe confederation, the Yamnaya, who first mastered horses around 3300 BCE, followed by the Sintashta, who perfected mounted warfare with chariots and composite bows around 2100 BCE. The Cimmerians inherited this 2000-year-old tradition of elite mounted warfare and brought it into the Iron Age. A note on terminology. Ancient Persians called all steppe nomads Saka. Ancient Greeks used Scythian, and Babylonians used Cimmerian as umbrella terms for the entire confederation. Modern scholars try to distinguish between specific groups, but the ancient sources themselves treated them as branches of the same cultural military complex. Ancient sources prove Cimmerians and Scythians were allies, not enemies, arriving in sequential waves 40 years apart in a coordinated expansion, following the same migration corridors their Yamnaya and Sintashta ancestors had used for millennia. The conflict between them was Greco-Roman propaganda designed to hide the fact they were the same network operating sequential deployments. Map evidence shows systematic encirclement of Assyria. Cimmerian forces from the north, east, and west. Scythian allies from the south. This wasn't random barbarian invasion, it was coordinated network elimination of a rival empire. When we trace the phonemic evolution, Gomer, Hebrew for Cimmerians, Cimmerian, Scythian, Saka, Khan, Ashkenazi, we see how the same bloodlines maintained institutional continuity for 3,000 years. Modern Ashkenazi banking families aren't a new phenomenon. They're the latest iteration of Cimmerian elite institutional knowledge operating through different cultural masks. The Phrygian family reunion, operational headquarters. And this coordination required a headquarters. That headquarters was Phrygia, and understanding what Phrygia really was changes everything about how we see this network's operations. Ancient sources tell us Phrygians came from the Balkans as Bryges, and migrated to Anatolia around 1200 BCE. But maps show Cimmerians arriving from the east at exactly the same time. This wasn't conquest, this was a family reunion. Both Bryges and Cimmerians were descendants of the same Yamnaya confederation, who had been separated for over 1,000 years, now reconvening in Anatolia. Phrygia became the confederation's operational headquarters, where scattered branches coordinated global operations. The Cybele mother goddess cult served as the religious technology binding the network together, ecstatic rituals, castrated priests maintaining bloodline control, and fertility ceremonies ensuring agricultural cycles. Phrygian language confuses scholars because it's not one language, it's the administrative pidgin of a multinational family reunion. This pattern repeats throughout history. 18 plus 19 Roman emperors came from the same Balkan corridor as the original Bryges. Medieval Khazar marriage alliances formalized the same network coordination. The Balkan-born Byzantine emperors weren't anomalies. They were evidence that the same bloodlines have been rotating through power in the same geographic corridors for millennia. The biblical geography confession, Ashkenaz in Phrygia. And here's where the biblical scribes accidentally gave away the whole game. Look at this 1854 map, the world as known to the Hebrews according to the Mosaic account. Right there, officially documented, Ashkenaz is placed directly in Phrygia, not in some distant northern wasteland, not in mysterious Khazaria, but right in the heart of our confederation's operational headquarters. The biblical genealogy spells it out. Ashkenaz, son of Gomer, grandson of Japheth, and where does Hebrew tradition place him? Exactly where we just documented the Phrygian family reunion, where Cimmerians, Gomer from the east, met Bryges from the Balkans. The German connection exposed medieval German chronicles are even more explicit. They state, the 20 captains or dukes that came with Ashkenaz are Sarmata, from whom Sarmatia, Dacus or Danus, Dania or Denmark. Stop right there. Danus giving his name to Denmark. That's our Dan phoneme again, the same confederation signature we've been tracking from the Danaoi to the Danube to the tribe of Dan. The text continues. Phrygus or Brigus, Phrygia. There it is in black and white. Ashkenaz's captains founding Phrygia, the same meeting ground where our Scythian-Semitic cooperation flourished. The Scythian Brotherhood. Ashkenaz had a brother called Scyther, say the Germans, the father of the Scythians, for which the Germans have of old been called Scythians too. This isn't mythology, it's genealogical memory. The Germans preserving their Scythian origins, Ashkenaz and Scyther as brothers. Indo-European and Semitic lines converging in Phrygia, exactly where the map places them. The 19th century German theologian August Wilhelm Nobel even derived the name of the Aesir, the Norse gods, from Ashkenaz. The Confederation's fingerprints are literally in the pantheon of Germanic mythology, the Asher ambiguity. Even more revealing is the biblical confusion about Asher. Genesis 10, 11, 12 can't decide if Nimrod or Asher built Nineveh, Kala, and Resen. The Dead Sea Scrolls lean toward Asher, but the ambiguity itself is the tell. Asher, second son of Shem, sits right next to Elam, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. These aren't random names, they're geographic markers for the Semitic sphere brushing against the Indo-European corridor. When Asher builds cities while his cousin Ashkenaz sits in Phrygia, we're seeing the Confederation's two wings, urban Semitic builders and steppe Indo-European horsemen operating in tandem. Daniel's Dan heritage, and then there's Daniel, literally God is my judge. But more importantly, Daniel, preserving that Dan tribal prefix. The same Daniel who serves in Babylon interprets dreams for Persian kings and bridges Semitic and Indo-European power structures. His very name encodes the maritime Dan Confederation, while his life story shows him navigating between Babylonian, Median, and Persian courts, all nodes in our network. the Luwian bridge, the missing maritime half of the matrix. But the Hurrians weren't the only architects of the Bronze Age operating system. There was another half of the Confederation, not inland but on the sea. That was the Luwians. You won't hear their name in the mainstream unless you're reading footnotes. But the Luwians were everywhere, and always exactly where the action was. Western Anatolia. Troy was a Luwian-speaking city, not Greek. Southern Anatolia, bordering Hurrian Syria and Canaan. Crete, where Linear A may preserve Luwian-like features. Mainland Greece, where a pre-Mycenaean substrate is increasingly seen as Luwian Hurrian, and even Canaan, where Luwian names appear in the Amarna letters. They were a sea and land-based confederation, the logistical, naval and linguistic glue between Troy, Crete, the Levant and the Aegean. If the Hurrians were the continental switchboard, the Luwians were the Mediterranean routers. Alvise Matessi's 2022 book, Bridging the Early Iron Age Aegean and Anatolia, Chapter 10. Late Bronze and Iron Age evidence discusses the Luwians. In the work, he explains the Phoenician name Denyen shows that it corresponds to Luwian Hiawa in the Chinookoi bilingual inscription, and acknowledges that Denyen is almost invariably equated with the Egyptian Denyen. In our framework, we know that means Denyen equals sign, Danuna equals Luwian Hiawa equals sea peoples. The very people who show up as the tribe of Dan in the Levant. Earlier in our video, we mentioned the Bible explains the tribe of Dan, unhappy with their lot, travel to the north and look for more land. They don't join up with the rest of the Israelites and are said to abode in ships. And if you look closely at this 8th century BCE map of Luwian and Aramean Semitic city-states, right there east of the Mediterranean coast, you'll see a name the Bible never expected you to find, Danunites. It's in the pink, look again. Next to Adana, or Land of Dan on the coast, with access to ports and Crete, where legends state the Denyen settled, and where we find Luwian inscriptions, not in Israel, not lost, but landed, next to Adana, under Azitawatus's quay, at the exact same maritime corridor the Book of Judges says Dan migrated through. These weren't lost tribes. They were seaborne powers, carved into Bronze Age maps long before the Hebrew scribes tried to fold them into a sanitized national myth. The Dan didn't disappear. They franchised. That same paper even notes mixed Greek and Luwian names appearing in Neo-Assyrian records from Tarsus, 8th, 7th C BCE, alongside references to Ionian Greek activity. But here's the twist. Some of those groups are labeled Yamnaya, the same name as the Steppe Confederation from 3,000 years prior. That's not coincidence, that's continuity. The Luwians in Action Troy, Luwian speaking. The attackers, Danaoi, the same name used by sea peoples, the Danites and the classical Greeks themselves. It wasn't Greek versus Trojan, it was a civil war inside the Dan Confederation, two wings of the same hybrid Hurrian-Luwian system. The storm god they worshipped, Tahunt, also called Teshub, Baal, Zeus, Thor, different dialects, same sky god. The writing systems they used, Luwian hieroglyphs, which show affinities with both Linear A and Proto-Canaanite. Their elite cities, like Lycia, give us the name of the Lukka, one of the most active sea peoples. The Shurden were another, a mixed mercenary fleet that worked first for Egypt, then attacked it. No fixed ethnicity, just a confederated maritime force. Why the Luwians matter. When Troy fell approximately 1200 BCE, the Luwian system didn't vanish, it migrated. The Denyen attacked Egypt. The Lukka raided the Levant. The Dan settled Tel Dan in Canaan. Their cousins ruled Greece as Danaoi. Others merged into the Phoenician world, bringing scripts, gods, and shipbuilding with them. These were not tribal units. They were operational wings of a much larger, much older matrix, the Hurrian-Luwian Confederation. And it had already been functioning for centuries. Even the mainstream scholars can't quite deny it. They write phrases like, the Denyen-Danaoi connection is speculative at best, cannot be counted as evidence, highly uncertain. But they're not saying it's wrong. They're saying their frameworks can't admit it yet. The takeaway, the Luwians were the maritime interface of the Bronze Age world. They linked Hurrian storm gods to Greek theology. They connected Anatolian pictographs to Phoenician letters. They moved ideas and people from Troy to Crete, from the Aegean to Canaan, and from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. They're the reason the same confederation could fight the Egyptians, settle the Levant and rule Mycenaean Greece. They're why the Denyen, Danaoi, and Danites all show up at once. They're why Luwian hieroglyphs, Linear A, and Phoenician script look like they shared an office. They are the missing maritime half of what made the sea peoples not just raiders, but survivors and reassemblers. But we don't have to speculate about Luwian and Semitic cooperation. We have direct visual proof from the 8th century BCE that shows these weren't separate civilizations, but integrated political zones with interlocking borders. Maps of Luwian post-Hittite states and Aramean Semitic kingdoms reveal strategic geographic clustering that proves coordinated control. Look at this. Danunites, sitting directly next to Baal in south-central Anatolia. Bit Adini, literally House of Adini, preserving that same DN route we've been tracking, controlling the strategic Euphrates crossing between Mesopotamia and the Levant. This isn't random geography. The Danunites provided maritime military expertise. Tabal controlled overland routes. Bit Adini managed the crucial river crossings. And Phoenician cities along the coast handled international trade networks. Together, they formed a comprehensive control system over the major Anatolia-Mesopotamia transit corridors. Casca remnants in the north show possible Proto-Khazarian elements. Gurgum, whose name echoes the Assyrian Gamir for Cimmerians. The Tibarines along the Black Sea coast were documented shipbuilders and mercenaries, exactly the maritime military profile we've seen in other Dan Confederation branches. What we're looking at is operational proof that Luwian and Aramean elites weren't just neighbors. They were integrated partners in the same Confederation management system centuries before the major Iron Age migrations. The Arabian Dan branch, Aramaic to Arabic linguistic preservation. And here's where this integration becomes even more explosive. The linguistic evidence shows that Aramaic becomes Arabic through direct evolution within the Central Semitic family. The same DN phoneme that appears in Aramean Bit Adini, the House of Dan we just saw on that 8th century map, becomes Adnan in Arabic genealogies centuries later. This preservation of the Dan DN phoneme wasn't accidental. The Arabian genealogies preserve Adnan as the ancestor of the northern Arab tribes, the Adnanites. Same phonetic root, Dan, Adnan, same function, elite tribal designation. Both the northern tribe of Dan and the Arabian Adnanites claim descent from the same Abrahamic lineage, proving they understood their common origin. The Adnanites didn't emerge in isolation. They came into the Arabian region as part of the same great Semitic and northern nomad invasions that reshaped the entire Middle East. They worked alongside these forces, becoming integrated partners in the same Hyksos mixed armies that had conquered Egypt centuries earlier. This reveals the three core phonemic pillars that the Confederation embedded across all cultures. Cain, Kin, Khan, Quayin, Khan, Kon, the authority, kinship root Shem, Simage, Shams, the solar deity ethnic designation root Dan, the territorial expansion root, which the Bible itself acknowledges, calling the Scythians Gog and Magog in Ezekiel. Ancient Jewish historian Josephus explicitly confirmed this connection, stating that Magog's descendants were called Scythians by the Greeks. The Hebrew sources weren't hiding the Dan-Scythian connection, they were documenting it. The religious technology transfer is equally clear. The sun god Shams in Arabian tradition connects directly to the Hurrian Simage we discussed earlier, transmitted through Mesopotamian Shamash. This same Sim-Shem root appears in Shem, the biblical patriarch of the Semites, proving the solar deity phoneme became embedded in the very ethnic designation Semitic itself. When Muhammad emerged claiming descent from the Adnanite lineage, he wasn't creating a new religious system. He was streamlining centuries of confederation management under unified leadership. The consolidation of Arabian tribes under Islam was network reactivation, not religious conversion. The Hebrew intelligence map, biblical confederation documentation. But the biblical geography reveals something even more explosive when you look at what they're actually mapping. The world as known to the Hebrews wasn't mythology. It was a strategic intelligence map documenting the entire confederation as they knew it. Look at what they recorded. Gomer in the north, that's the Cimmerians, Magog directly adjacent, the Scythians that Josephus explicitly confirmed. Madai, the Medes who fought alongside both against Assyria. Tubal, named right next to Gog and Magog in Ezekiel's prophecies. Aram, the Arameans from our 8th century map showing Bit Adini and the Danunites. And then the smoking gun, Dodanim, sitting in Greece. The Dan phoneme in the very zone where Homer's Danaoi ruled and where Leicester Holland traced the Denyen sea peoples. The Assyrian connection even more telling. Javan, the biblical Ionians, are the same Yawan that the Assyrians explicitly called Scythians when describing their mercenary fleets and raiding partners. In other words, to the Assyrians, the Ionian Greeks weren't a separate people. They were just another branch of the Dan-Scythian maritime confederation. The operational theatre map. Once you see this, the pattern is obvious. Sons of Japheth, =, Northern Maritime Steppe Block, Dan/Scythian/Cimmerian Ionian networks. Sons of Ham, =, Southern Red Sea, Egyptian Phoenician Maritime Trade Block. Sons of Shem, =, Levantine Mesopotamian kin and client networks. The Table of Nations wasn't a family tree. It was a geopolitical theatre map marking friend, foe and rival franchise zones in the same way any intelligence service would. The Tartessos Bridge. Around 900 BCE, as Phoenician power peaked, a mysterious civilization flourished in southern Spain, Tartessos. Greek writers called it fabulously wealthy, possessing advanced technology, sophisticated metallurgy. Herodotus compared it to Atlantis. Phoenician ships docked there. Celtic bloodlines merged there. The city controlled the Atlantic tin routes from Cornwall to the Mediterranean. Then around 500 BCE, Tartessos vanished. No invasion, no disaster. It simply disappeared, exactly when Celtic Atlantic power exploded, when the Hallstatt culture transformed into Latene, when iron technology revolutionized Europe. Tartessos wasn't destroyed, it was decommissioned. Its job complete, its elites dispersed to new nodes, Ireland, Denmark, and across the Atlantic. Tartessos, but the echo is real. There's a moment after Tartessos disappears from history, sometime around 500 BCE, where it begins to echo, not just as a memory of metal-rich kings and strange ships on Iberian shores, but as part of something deeper. A myth of collapsed survivors. A memory that gets reshaped, misused, and then finally hijacked. This is where Tartessos starts to rhyme with Tartaria. They're not the same place, but they serve the same symbolic role. Lost lands born in the ashes of vanished power. Mythic placeholders for people who remember a world that ended. Myths built by the displaced after the Bronze Age collapsed. Elites were scattered. Sea peoples, Denyen, Lukka, Mycenaeans, Scythians, Khazars, Yamnaya chieftains turned refugees, traders, or warlords. Some became kings again. Some deified themselves. Some rewrote their defeat as divine destiny, just like Urnamu did in Mesopotamia, or like the Tuatha Dé Danann did in Ireland. Over time, the myths grew. Here are 4 paradigm-changing examples. Case Study 1, Atlantis, the chosen race that fell beneath the waves, which Blavatsky, the occultist, painted as Nordic whites from Siberia. When the Industrial Revolution threatened to expose the ancient networks through archaeology and linguistics, they needed a new cover story, something to get the less informed side tracked, something like Stitchin with his Anunnaki laugh. Enter Helena Blavatsky. Born into Russian aristocracy in 1831, Blavatsky wasn't just creating theosophy. She was repackaging the vault's knowledge for a new age and paving the way for controlled New Age religions and manipulation, much like the lost alien astronaut theorists today. Consider her background. Descended from the von Hahn family, German nobility with ties to the same Baltic networks we've been tracking. Born in Ukraine, the literal Yamnaya heartland. Married at 17 to a vice-governor, connecting her to Russian imperial administration, traveled extensively through Tibet, India, Egypt, Kashmir, all the vault's ancient nodes, following the exact Silk Road corridors where our confederation operated for millennia. But here's what they don't tell you. Blavatsky's secret doctrine perfectly mirrors the vault's operational manual. She wrote about root races, with Aryans as the 5th and most advanced. That's the same mythology the Kurgan descendants used to justify their dominance. She placed the origins of advanced civilization in Central Asia, exactly where the Yamnaya emerged from Sarazm. She spoke of Atlantis and Lemuria, encoding the memory of the maritime networks we've been documenting. And then she drops the phonemic bomb without even realizing it. When Blavatsky writes of the Dhyan Chohan, the lords of meditation guiding humanity, she unknowingly stitches together the entire Confederation lexicon. Danu from the Aryan Vedic East, the same route as the goddess Danu we've been tracking, Danann from the steppe and sea peoples, and Chohan, phonemically identical to Cohen, the Hebrew priestly title, and Khan, the steppe ruler designation. It's a phonemic time capsule, Vedic river goddesses, Danite sea raiders, Hebrew temple priests, and Mongol Khans, compressed into one mystical term by a Russian aristocrat from the Yamnaya heartland who spent years in Kashmir and Tibet, right where all these linguistic currents converged along the Silk Road. Her concept of ascended masters, secretly guiding humanity, that's literally the Volt priesthood rebranded as spiritual evolution. The Great White Brotherhood she described, look at the terminology, white, brotherhood, hierarchical spiritual authority. She's describing the R1b patrilineal networks in occult language. The Theosophical Society's symbol tells the whole story, a serpent swallowing its tail surrounding a swastika and Star of David, the Serpent of Dan, the Indo-European solar symbol, the Semitic seal. She literally put the entire Confederation's symbolism in one logo, but most importantly, Blavatsky created the template for controlled disclosure. When archaeological discoveries threatened to expose the network, she preemptively framed it all as ancient wisdom and spiritual evolution. She turned the Volt's history into mythology, their bloodlines into spiritual races, their network into hidden masters. The Thule pipeline, from mysticism to mass murder. The next figure in this chain makes it all painfully obvious how this occult rebranding becomes political weaponization. Adam Alfred Rudolf Glauer, better known as Rudolf Freiherr von Sebottendorf, would take Blavatsky's racial occult framework and distill it into pure political poison. And his background reads like a Volt operative's resume. The network grooming, 1900 Turkey, taken in by wealthy Hussein Pasha, a Sufi mystic Bursa, introduced to the Temudi family of Thessaloniki, Sephardic Jewish bankers, silk traders, and Freemasons in the Memphis Mizraim Rite Lodge initiation, brought into their Masonic network tied directly to the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks who would overturn the Ottoman Empire, the inheritance. When Temudi died, Sebottendorf inherited his entire occult library, Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, Sufi alchemy, numerology. Think about what we're seeing here, a German. Nobody gets adopted by Ottoman nobility through dubious means, inherits a Jewish banking family's occult library, becomes a Freemason through Sephardic sponsors, fights for the Ottomans in the Balkan Wars, then returns to Germany with a Turkish passport to found the Thule Society, which directly inspired Nazi racial ideology. The irony is breathtaking. One of the key architects of the Nazi Aryan myth was likely a crypto-Jew operating through a Sephardic banking and Masonic network, pushing racial theories that would eventually target the very networks that created him. This was pure theosophy weaponized, Blavatsky's root races and hidden masters reformulated into political action. The Thule Society didn't just inspire early Nazis, it provided the entire mystical framework for racial superiority wrapped in runes and swastikas that Blavatsky had already popularized. The playbook exposed: adopt an elite mask, fake nobility through Ottoman adoption, enter through esoteric circles, Sufi Masonic Kabbalistic fusion. Seed a racial myth as political glue, Aryan supremacy via Thule, hand off to political actors, early Nazi party members. His entire operation reeks of intelligence work, Ottoman citizenship during the Balkan Wars, Masonic ties throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, a criminal record for fraud and forgery, multiple aliases including Erwin Torre, sudden shifts between Turkey, Egypt and Germany during high operational periods. This isn't a mystic's journey, it's an operative's career arc, and they're running the exact same play right now, only instead of Thule societies and swastikas, it's Tartaria maps, mud flood theories, Slavic Aryan super-civilization myths, and 5D ascension narratives. Different centuries, same playbook, same Confederation fingerprints. When you see online influencers pushing lost white civilizations, suppressed Aryan history, or ancient advanced races, you're watching Blavatsky to Sebottendorf Pipeline 2.0. The same intelligence occult fusion, the same racial myths, the same hidden hand posing as revelation. The Volt never died, it just keeps changing its mask, and the mask it's wearing today looks suspiciously like the one from 1920s Munich. Case study 2, Tartaria, the lost global empire with laser towers and mud floods. Nikolai Viktorovich Levashov wasn't just a self-proclaimed psychic healer. He was a Soviet military insider who, after claiming to run for president of the USSR, moved to the United States pushing a blend of pseudo-history, race mythology, and Slavic supremacist mysticism. Like Helena Blavatsky before him, Levashov wrapped his ideology in ancient wisdom and occult science. But the subtext was pure elite propaganda. Levashov's career reads like an intelligence op, claimed to heal with his hands. Several patients died under his care, claimed telepathic contact with dolphins, bragged about political influence at the highest levels of the collapsing Soviet Union. Celebrity healers with spots on the hit show Unsolved Mysteries. He and Anatoly Fomenko became the loudest voices behind Tartaria, the myth of a lost global empire with advanced technology, laser towers, and mud flood cover-ups. What they won't tell you is that Tartaria began as white Aryan Russian Tatar nationalist propaganda in the 1980s, rooted in the same Yamnaya Slavic pride currents as Blavatsky's theosophy. The universal version only emerged decades later, once the racial edge was softened for global internet audiences. Levashov was essentially Blavatsky 2.0, an aristocratic product of the same Eurasian steppe power base, blending Aryan origin mythologies with selective Eastern wisdom into a cultural weapon. The overlap is obvious. Blavatsky's fusion of Vedic, Buddhist, and Aryan elements mirrors Levashov's Slavic Vedas, both attempts to rewrite history to put their network's bloodlines at the center of global civilization. Case study 3 and 4, the tribe of Dan, appropriated to everyone in the world except for the people they really were, the Scythians, a non-Christian bunch of skull-cup drinkers in their time, marauders who would circle a town until walled cities starved. And yes, there were plenty of rumors of their cannibalism. To be fair, the skull-cup drinking didn't help. And Hyperborea, the frozen land beyond the north wind, was never meant to be in the Arctic. Greek sources from Herodotus, Pindar, Hecataeus, and others originally placed it in the Scythian zone, just north of the Black Sea, across the Danube through the Riphean mountains near the Isodones. It wasn't fantasy. It was a mythic rebrand of the Indo-European launchpad, the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the R1/R1b genetic homeland, where the Volt protocols began. In their own way, the Greeks remembered where they came from, not in myth, but in migration memory. Hercules crossing the Danube to reach Hyperborea, that wasn't legend. It was a glyph of steppe passage, a symbolic crossing from southern civilization into Volt-cast emergence. Just like the Tuatha Dé Danann and the tribe of Dan, Hyperborea became a whitewashed metaphor for the overwrite zone, where displaced elites rewrote themselves into gods, priests, and chosen races. The Tartaria problem, millions today believe in Tartaria. Not the real one, but the fantasy version. The kind cooked up by Anatoly Fomenko, a 20th century Russian nationalist who claimed the historical timeline had been shifted by 3,000 years. He said all ancient empires were fake. Rome didn't exist. The Mongols were Russians. The Renaissance was a lie. He invented a great Tartarian empire that ruled the world with tech we've now lost, and people bought it. Later fringe writers racialized this fake empire, claimed Tartaria was white, chosen, pure, erased by a global cabal, star forts, mud floods, ancient tech. It's not archaeology. It's apocalypse mythology with a nationalist twist. The real Tartars were already more interesting. The real Tartars, like the Volga Tatars, Khazars, Yamnaya remnants, and Scythian successors, didn't need pseudoscience. They built the largest land empires the world had ever seen, from China to Hungary. They used Kipchak Turkic as their lingua franca, but carried steppe genetic lineages like R1b, and mixed heavily with Finno-Ugric and Ulchi-like Eastern ancestries. They founded Islamic Khanates, traded by sea and river, and ruled confederations that mirrored the Bronze Age Dan networks. And they weren't religiously uniform. The Khazar Empire alone practiced Judaism, Tengri steppe animism, Islam, Christian Orthodoxy, and more. Their capitals had synagogues, mosques, Byzantine-style churches, Persian palaces, and nomadic yurt cities side by side. This wasn't a lost utopia. It was a fluid, adaptive power system based on trade, force, and shifting loyalties, not divine purity. Why it all gets mythologized. Just like the Scythians and Bel-Beaker elites before them, who took over Europe twice, once in the Bronze Age and again as Huns, Avars, Franks, and Khazars, these groups eventually rewrote their own violence as destiny. Their grandsons turned conquest into chosenness. Their mythologies overwrite the older local layers of Europe and the Levant. The Joshua story is just the steppe story again. Yamnaya elites burning towns, replacing DNA and writing replacement theology to justify it. Tartaria then is not about truth. It's about longing for a time when we were the masters of a lost world. It's really just the tales of a nomadic elite class with rotating nodes of power built on the backs of the people turned slaves they conquered. Sometimes it's just the direct takeover of a former people's land, buildings and pantheons.